Right, welcome everybody to this lunchtime session. Great to have you all on board. A few more people just arriving now. Sorry, I think a few people got the link a little late, so I'll just let you in now. I'm Louisa Taylor. I'm the General Manager of Canterbury Tech, and I'm just going to do a few quick updates about Canterbury Tech before I hand over to our Acting Chair, Seku, to introduce our speaker for today. You can turn on the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. If you'd like to put in questions at any time during the session, you're welcome to do that, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. And also, if you have any topics that you would like to see for lunchtime sessions, maybe we could warm up a little bit with that. Tell us where you're watching in from today. Are you joining us from Otatahi, Christchurch, or are you somewhere else today? And what would you like to see as a topic covered in one of our lunchtime sessions soon? So feel free to pop that in the chat now. Thanks to all of our Canterbury Tech sponsors. We obviously couldn't do this without you. These are our annual sponsors currently, and we are going to have a few opportunities for new sponsors soon. So if you are interested, please do get in touch with us at info@canterburytech.nz. So the UC Business School, they have an MBA program that is really hitting the mark at the moment, some really future-focused courses, and the Executive Education program, which I teach design thinking at as well. So it's a nice connection. AWS, known for their infrastructure services, but they are ready to assist you with all sorts of business knowledge. So if you are looking to explore something new for your business, they're a great team to reach out and get in touch with. Lumen PDF, these are a global but headquartered in Christchurch. They provide a PDF editing software, which is great in not only the Google suite, but across all of your different operating systems as well. Such an awesome team, and a local product, which is really great for improving your efficiencies in your office. We've got Stratos Technology Partners. Their CEO, David Carter, has been a long-term supporter and committee member of Canterbury Tech. They've also just joined as the sponsor of our mentorship program, which kicked off last night to great success, I think. So thanks so much, Stratos, for your support of that. Integration Works, they're busy expanding their team here in Christchurch, and they do integrations between different systems, and they've been helping Canterbury Tech with integrating some of our systems, which has been fantastic. Great team to work with. And Crescent Consulting, a recruitment company here in Christchurch, again, long-term supporters of Canterbury Tech, real specialists in your technology hiring needs. If you're looking for staff, get in touch with them. One of the benefits we've been able to provide to our members over the last few months, and this is a new benefit for our company members, is you're able to publish a blog to the website, and we've been having some really great expertise from our members to share that with the community. So if you've got an idea for a knowledge sharing blog, something that shows off your expertise, then please do find this under the News and Views section under the Submit a Blog page, and we'll be happy to look at publishing that. Make sure that it's not a sales pitch, though. It really needs to be like focused on that knowledge sharing, and to be original material. So follow the link there on the website if you'd like to share some information. And we pick up a couple each month that we publish in our newsletter as well, so it gets a lovely wide readership there, going out to 5,000 or so of our readership. The Canterbury Tech Summit, our flagship event, we're all got a laser focus on the Canterbury Tech Summit at the moment. Our tickets are all on sale. We've got student tickets, we've got about 50 of those available. We've got members tickets, and we've got non-members tickets. but they do sell out. And last year I had people begging me the month before the summit for tickets, and I'm afraid we weren't able to help them. So please do get in early if you want to go, because they will sell out. We're over 70% sold already. So this is the most reasonably priced one-day conference, and the way we keep it that way is because we rely on our sponsors and exhibitors to help that make really accessible for people at any stage in their business or career to come along. If you're an employer, think about giving your teams the day off to come together, because it's such a great professional development opportunity, and it can also help raise your profile with new talent and clients and expand your network. So we've really leveled up our exhibition space this year, got these spacious 3x3 spots, and rather than being in a separate area, the exhibition hall will be the center of the universe for the summit, where all our meals will be served. So it'll be a hive of activity. We have sold out of all of our room naming sponsorships, the lanyards and the meals, but we do have platinum, gold and silver. I think we've got one platinum left, one gold and a couple of silvers left. So please get in now before those sell out as well. We'd really appreciate your support of the community to keep that really accessible. We've got something a bit different this year as well. The day before the summit, so the summit's on the 5th of September, the day before, on the Monday, the 4th of September, we have our keynote speaker, Rich Mironov, who is one of the world's leading experts in product management, especially in that B2B space. And he's running 2 masterclass sessions, one for product managers or people working in product, the other one specifically for CEOs and leaders of product companies. That's going to be quite a unique opportunity to get up close to somebody who is that expert in those areas and ask all of those tricky questions. For the CEOs, we're also running a cocktail session after that, so you have a chance to socialize with Rich and get to know him the day before his big opening presentation of our summit. So that's pretty exciting. And we had so many applications to talk this year, and a lot of them obviously were about AI. So we've put together a special 3 different perspectives of AI and how it's being used in Canterbury businesses. So that'll be our middle keynote, is actually these 3 different perspectives. So that's going to be a pretty exciting thing. So we've got the techies, people actually doing the AI, people using AI to improve their processes, and then other people providing services to help other people with AI. So 3 quite different perspectives about how that's happening in Christchurch. Very interesting talk. So check out our full program on the www.techsummit.nz website. It's got all of our programmers now released. Now, don't forget about our August in-person event. You can sign up now. I think the links went live today. Maybe later, if someone wants to pop that link into the chat, we can get that up there too. But we have the amazing Amy Whitcroft joining us. She has been working with the UN, and she's going to be presenting on taking agency of Canterbury's future using data and AI ethics. So it's going to be quite an interesting discussions about those fundamentally important components of how we leverage the power of data to make a stronger, kinder and more resilient, thriving Canterbury. And she has a lot of international experience she's going to share with us, so that's pretty exciting. The venue, we're just deciding, so we'll get Jen to tell me later if we've finalized that, but should be finalized today. It's at Epic. She's just telling me there. We have secured the Epic Centre, which you all know is like right on Manchester Street in the centre of town. So that is sorted. Perfect. Last thing is, if you want to find out more about our events, you can actually subscribe now to our calendar. So if you go to the events page on our website, and then you click the subscribe button at the top, you can actually just import it into your calendar, so you'll know not only the Canterbury Tech events, but all the other community events that people submit their events to our calendar. So we've got that wider view of what's going on in the ecosystem. So I encourage you to add that to your calendar today. So now I'll hand over to Seiko, who is our deputy chair, but now acting as our chair while Vaughan is overseas for a few months. So Seiko, thank you. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Louisa. Thank you for the updates. Hello, kia ora, everyone. Looks like a great day today, eh, Sunny? So before we go into introducing David, I want you guys to go into the emoji and choose an emoji, an animal emoji, just that shows you how you're doing today. I'm going to give some time to get to it because it's so sunny and nice. So I'm going to Sunny. Yes, Louisa, great. And welcome. While everyone is posting the emoji, I'm going to welcome Catherine from West Coast and Max from Kirikirio and Anna Lee and other Christchurch Canterbury people all the time. And hello from Ponike, Paul, welcome. And David Thompson from Canada. Wow, great. And yeah, a few others who's joining in. I'm getting to see a lot of sunny pictures and excited pictures from Marianne and meow pictures from emoji from Max Johns. So I'm gonna send my emoji. I am feeling like a chicken coming out of a thing. Yeah, that's me. Amy Whitcroft. Okay, David Thompson. Hi, hello. Yes, flamingo, Dan. Good on you. Annalie seems very curious, and Leslie is yes, thumbs up, and Vlad is having a squirrel, and Catherine is kind of lost in the question, and Robin is feeling cool, and we have Matthew. Yes, good on you. Yeah, welcome everyone. And so I can't see everyone's faces, so I'm going to go around and check the emojis and try to get to know you more. But thank you, David. Hello, David. Good to have you here. And David is the CTO of Catalyst Cloud. He is going to talk about data sovereignty, or he doesn't want to talk about data sovereignty. So he's going to answer some of the questions that we have about data sovereignty and why are many agencies and companies reluctant to talk about it. And he's going to explore the fun landscapes about random bits of laws and terms and conditions and data, along with pictures of his puppies to distract us more. But previously, before his stint as CTO, he joined Catalyst Cloud in 2020 by swapping laptops in his home office during lockdown. And he is currently signing in from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, but he has a Christchurch connection because he's lived in here for 10 years, apparently, and he's been a University of Canterbury graduate too. And although he has run the systems for nearly 30 years, he is nowhere allowed to have an admin rights on a server. He seems very bummed about it. But we have been chatting about it. He's so awesome. He knows more about the dark ages of the internet, and he's been following the entire journey of the internet and data as such. So he comes with a lot of wealth of knowledge that he's going to share today. David, how are you feeling today? Great.
I'm feeling good. I really want to thank everyone for coming along to this session and for the support that Canterbury Tech are showing for everyone in Canterbury and the community as a whole. So thank you very much for kind of having me along for this.
Fantastic, David. I'm going to pass on the baton to you so you can start sharing your screen and show us what you got in store for us. And while he's presenting, if anybody has any questions, you can put it in the comments and I will make a note of it. And after the session, I will curate it and ask David that is relevant to the session, and the majority of Canterbury Tech members can take the value out of as such. So don't forget to do that when we are in the conversation too. Thank you. David, all yours.
Thank you. So I was going to show a whole lot of slides, but as someone kind of rightly pointed out, my slides have an awful lot of words on it because I'm a bit of a wordy person, and I tend to get into all of the nitty-gritty details about the words that are actually used in laws and used in proposals and policies and so on and so forth. So rather than that, I'm going to talk more broadly now about data sovereignty rather than bury you in very wordy slides. I'd like to begin by first just talking a little bit about Catalyst Cloud. We are an Aotearoa New Zealand-based and operated public cloud. And by a public cloud, I mean an actual full public cloud that does things the way large clouds are kind of expected to do things. It's not a copy of a traditional virtualization system with a ticketing system on the side of it. It works the way any cloud is supposed to be operated. We also are very careful about how our compliance works, because a lot of organizations expect to see compliance with both international and local standards. We have a bunch of numbers that are associated with that, like ISO 27001, 27017, PCI DSS. We also have more local certifications, such as the Security Services Certificate that's issued by Internal Affairs, relating to the way government stores data. These are all relatively hard to get. In particular, the Security Services Certificate really, the way that that's done is involves external auditors who root around through all of our systems at the behest of Internal Affairs, and we share the report openly with them. So it's quite an intense certificate to actually get. As I said, I joined Catalyst Cloud by swapping laptops in the middle of lockdown. That has to be the strangest way I've ever switched between jobs. Normally you have a little party and you gather together and you do all those sorts of things. And instead it was packing one laptop into one machine and into one box and unpacking another laptop. And that was my job change. I've spent a lot of time caring about infrastructure. Infrastructure is probably the thing that I've spent most of my time over most of my career. Which somehow has turned into 30 years, which is a little bit alarming. I still call it IT because I'm a bit old school, and I don't like everything being called digital. But if we want to call it digital, then we can call it digital. And as was mentioned, I no longer have admin rights on anything because I'm management and I can't be trusted with admin rights on anything. It's fair enough. We'll live with that. I said. The name of this talk is kind of, I don't want to talk about data sovereignty. And that has a really multifaceted meaning for me, because actually I sometimes personally don't want to talk about data sovereignty. It's a difficult subject to talk about. It's a hard subject to get across in how it impacts us and how it impacts the decisions that we make. And often I think a lot of people, both technical and non-technical, are kind of focused more on, we want solutions that just work, and we don't necessarily want to care about the worries of state actors or we've got data governance and that's going to solve all of our problems, or, you know, can you just stop talking about this data sovereignty thing? And it's unfortunate in a lot of ways, because as technologists, we actually are custodians of other people's data, and it's important to remember that it's other people's data. It's important to remember that there are a lot of people relying on our advice and our expertise and our understanding of the risks, and that when we kind of stick our head in the sand and just want to go and look at pictures of puppies, that we are falling down on kind of our obligations to help people make sure that their data that they actually own is well protected against a variety of different threats. So, you know, it's not a subject I love talking about. I find it very difficult. I think a lot of people find it very difficult. But we're just going to have to put on our big kid underpants and dive into this stuff. The first thing that I kind of want to touch on about data sovereignty is that it is very common to think of this purely in terms of personal information, right? The most common discussion that comes up when you start talking about data sovereignty is really the stuff where we're talking about personal data or personal information or PII or whatever any particular piece of legislation calls it, because it varies all over the world, thankfully. But data shouldn't be thought of as purely just the personal information that you've obtained from other people, or information that is a product of who they are, like genetics. That is certainly a big chunk of the data that's of concern. But data also includes intellectual property. It also includes cultural knowledge. It includes a wide variety of information that's stored in machines for a wide variety of purposes. It is not a good idea to look at this purely through the lens of privacy. It is more important to look at through the lens of what are the obligations we have to the people whose data this actually really is. So it is important to take into account that because this is about how laws affect data, that it shouldn't be seen as purely just privacy. Privacy is a very big part of it. Privacy is probably the area that has the most activity around new laws and new thinking. But it isn't the only part about data that we should be concerned about. In that context, what then do we really mean by data sovereignty? Well, it very much comes down to something quite simple: the legal jurisdiction that is applied to the data. More specifically, which country's laws apply to that data, and the ability to enforce those decisions about data. Now, it's very easy to confuse this concept with governance. And a lot of organizations will say, well, we have data governance. We are very careful about our data governance. We're very careful about the way we protect our data. And that's true, and that may be that their good intent is very evident in the way that they're protecting their data. But that doesn't necessarily address the things that happen to the provider that is helping support those systems, or any other part of the supply chain necessary to host and manage and manipulate that data. So while it's easy for organizations to say, hey, look, we're very good at governing our data, we have very clear models about how we secure our data, to ignore the fact that there are supply chain issues is an enormous risk. So data governance doesn't cover enough of this. I know a lot of people want to try and pull out data sovereignty and put data governance in there instead, but I don't feel that governance is a strong enough coverage of the risks that are faced by data when there is an enormous supply chain behind how it's actually handled and stored. Now, I said enforcement is important because, you know, while the risk is that any of these laws could potentially apply, they really don't have any effect unless they can actually be enforced against an entity, an agency, a supplier, some part of the supply chain. Simply that there are laws that exist doesn't mean that they can be meaningfully enforced. And so when looking at data sovereignty, you've also got to take into account how effective the enforcement of those particular laws are. For example, how much of a presence is there in a jurisdiction, or how much revenue is tied to that jurisdiction? What degree of access can actually really be leveraged on the data? Because that's not actually a fairly straightforward problem either. And whether or not there are any bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements between countries that essentially respect foreign courts or foreign decisions. The most obvious example of this kind of cross-border agreement would be the United States Cloud Act. But there are other agreements, and these can creep into all sorts of interesting places, like trade agreements, for example, often have some very interesting clauses about the respect of cross-border courts. Now, there's a delicate subject that we need to talk about, and that is this idea of data residency. There are a number of providers, who I won't name, that make the claim that where your data resides is what determines the laws that protect it. And I appreciate that it is true that the laws of where your data reside logically apply to that data. That is not the only laws that can apply to that data. it is very dependent on what another country can do to the organization in terms of what they can then enforce. In some jurisdictions, such as the United States, specifically under the Cloud Act, it is very, very clear that if there is even minimal contact with a United States-based entity, any data stored globally falls under the purview of US courts. So while while it would be lovely and easy if we could just say, look, the data is physically in one country and therefore that's the only laws that apply to it, that's not actually what happens in reality. And to ignore the entire problem and just say, oh, look, so long as you store data in one country, you're safe, is a really unfortunate claim to make. And one that we need to be very suspicious of the motivation behind that claim. Now, what kind of enforcement, is really possible with laws of other countries? Let me give you some examples of cross-border law enforcement complexities. One that comes up from time to time that actually has very little to do with data sovereignty, but is a really good illustration of cross-border enforcement, is where a court in New Zealand, for example, will order name suppression for one or more reasons. Let's not get into the reasons why. And then a newspaper in another country publishes the name. Now, this is clearly in breach of a New Zealand court order. There's no ambiguity about this. The newspaper is clearly in breach of that court order because the court order says you're not allowed to publish that person's name. Now, if that newspaper has no revenue or no presence in New Zealand, then what happens? The answer is nothing. The law is not enforceable on a newspaper in another country, even if that newspaper is accessible via the internet from New Zealand. There is nothing to seize. There is no pressure that can be applied to that organization. There's no revenue that can be taken. You can't use threats of imprisonment or anything else that the New Zealand court system may want to apply. And so the enforcement of that law is very much moot into another country. Now, if we think about something like our Privacy Act, how would we enforce our Privacy Act on an organization that has no presence in New Zealand? The answer is you kind of can't. It would be nice to think that that was possible and everyone will play nice and agree that those are the rules that we should follow. But the reality is they don't actually have anything that compels them to follow it. No more than a newspaper in another country has to follow our name suppression orders. Now, the reverse can also be true. It can also be true that even if you have no presence in a country, even if you have no data in a country, or you even have no presence beyond physical presence in that country, that nonetheless your laws can end up being enforced on you. The most obvious example of this would be the European Union's GDPR. Under the GDPR, if you are storing European citizen data that is as a result of marketing towards Europeans, then you are subject to GDPR. It doesn't actually mention where. You don't necessarily have to be within the EU to be subject to GDPR. How this then gets enforced is really fairly straightforward. If you have a lot of income in the EU, then the EU can tap that and they can leverage fines against you. Now, this is a strong enough mechanism that even though, for example, a company that may be operating a large social media platform will end up being fined by the European Union, despite the fact that none of the data involved actually resides within the EU. It all resides in the United States. But because there is revenue to tap, they can enforce it, and therefore this becomes a huge liability problem for an organization that's not technically based in the EU. This is strong enough that I don't want to name the company, but they recently wanted to launch another social media platform, and it wasn't launched in the EU specifically because of the risk that it posed to the company in terms of compliance with GDPR. Not a company based in the EU still has to comply with European law. Even if those examples kind of sound a bit fanciful, like I'm sort of trying to stretch the truth here. This risk is quite well acknowledged in a number of important pieces of regulations and in legislation. Specifically in New Zealand, the New Zealand Information Security Manual, which is maintained by GCSB, states in 2327, if you want to know the exact reference, that there is a risk that while a service could be physically hosted in New Zealand, if there is any management of that service from outside New Zealand, then they may end up being subjected to a wide variety of laws that may conflict with New Zealand law, and that government agencies and in turn, to a certain extent, private agencies should be taking that risk seriously. It's a serious risk. This is not, these concepts are not something that are kind of just invented for competitive reasons. This is, GCSB being very clear that you actually need to consider very seriously what is the supply chain for the services that you're using. Now, I mentioned data access because data access is also commonly a part of what is expected in terms of decision enforcement. A great example is our New Zealand Privacy Act. It requires agencies to correct information, and they can be compelled, as much as you can be if you're not in New Zealand, to correct that data. But a lot of those decisions really depend on the service provider cooperating with the decisions. If you are using a cloud service provider way outside New Zealand, you've uploaded data or they have data on you that is not correct and you want to correct that information, even if the data was physically stored in New Zealand, it's very likely to be stored in a way that the courts certainly can't enforce that directly on a service provider. It's going to require the service provider to cooperate with those laws, and maybe they just don't want to. Worse, the supply chain of how these services are all stacked together may not even be visible to you. You may not even have any awareness of exactly which services are used to maintain access to your data, and therefore who you could actually enforce any decision upon. So data access is, it certainly is made more complicated by the fact that, inevitably there's some software layer that's responsible for actually dealing with the data. And that, okay, you have a local service provider that says that they will comply. They may not be in a position where they actually can. You may be still dependent on a third party outside New Zealand to actually affect meaningful change in that data. There's also the complication of encryption. Encryption is in some ways both a benefit and a curse in this discussion. It's an enormous benefit if you're trying to protect data from being accessed. It's less good if you are trying to force correction of data, because obviously that makes it even harder for anyone but the person that put the data in place to actually correct it. But leaning on encryption is a bit of a crutch, because it doesn't magically protect your data from access outside a legal jurisdiction. For example, and this has come up in discussions with government, the position is that, well, it's okay that we're storing data with a multinational cloud provider because it's encrypted. Well, the first question is, where's the key? Because if the key is sitting inside the cloud provider's services, then the cloud provider still has access to that key. It doesn't change anything that there's encryption involved. The cloud provider still has access to that key. And indeed, if you've got services that are using, so-called customer managed keys, they effectively provide nothing in terms of protection against the cloud provider being compelled to access that data. They might provide a little bit of protection against, someone leaking a common key that is used by lots of customers, but that's a very different risk to the data sovereignty concerns about who can be compelled to access your data. Customer managed keys don't help at all with that. And so really, if you're relying on encryption to prevent access to that data, you need to think very, very carefully about where that encryption is taking place, and therefore where the keys are. It's no good if you say, right, well, we're going to store this piece of data, but the encryption takes place on a VM inside the cloud provider. Well, okay, yes, it's hard to get the key, but it's not impossible, and therefore you have to assume that compelled enough by a court that a provider will open up whatever is required to do that. So encryption it's not a magic bullet. A few times I've seen particularly government agencies say, well, it's encrypted, or we have a managed key for it, so it's all fine, or even more hilariously, that they're going to be told when this access takes place. That's not actually technically as true as may have been promised to people. The problem that we then end up with all of this is really that any multinational offering cloud services is stuck with quite a difficult bit of compliance. It has to comply with the laws of the place where the data is physically stored. It has to comply with laws where it has any significant presence. It has to comply with laws that may actually contradict each other, and may even require the bypassing of the local laws that they think they're also subjected to. And in the end, most multinationals are going to probably take a fairly simple approach to this, where they're going to look at revenue. How much revenue am I going to lose by fighting the compliance in a particular jurisdiction? So yes, the examples that are often given is, well, if a particular cloud provider operates in a country that has largely a dictatorship, surely they're not just going to comply with that dictatorship, and the answer is no, they probably won't. They'll look at the revenue that they're getting from that region and go, well, no, we'll just pull out and not have that problem. But if they have a significant amount of revenue, and I'm looking very closely at the United States at this point, then their willingness to lose that revenue to protect your local laws is up for some debate. And there are examples of this, which I can't talk about right now because they name specific companies, so we'll have to just skip off from that. This means that if you really want to limit your jurisdictional risk, you have to be very careful about the providers that you use for the entire supply chain. And if you don't want your data to be subjected to some creative laws, like, for example, in Australia, the law that says that the security services can compel developers to insert backdoors into your software, and it's unlawful to mention this to anyone. It becomes a crime to mention it. Then you have got to be very careful about where you actually put your data. If you don't want your data subject to the laws of another country, then the provider you use cannot operate in that country. That's what it comes down to. Or if you want to put it another way, if you only want New Zealand law and New Zealand principles to apply to your data, then you have no choice but to choose providers that only operate in New Zealand and no other country. It's not good enough to say, well, they're physically present in this country, because they're present in other countries, and that will complicate the legal jurisdiction. So I think probably at this point that's enough chatter, and I have no doubt there's many questions that people probably have about what the various acts are that can apply to your data and how this actually plays out in the real world. So I'd like to open the floor if possible to questions.
Could I, David, could I ask a question? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh.
Go on,
Hey,
Jared,
I run a law firm, and we do family law. So we've got issues not only with the Privacy Act and the Lawyers and Conveyancers Act, but also the rules around the family court and the confidentiality of data. We've been very passionate about resisting the cloud because of data sovereignty issues, and followed the movement of the Patriot Act and the Microsoft v US government, etc., and weren't satisfied with the Cloud Act either. I guess I'm wondering if there are any other industries or sectors similar to us that have a piece of legislation like the Lawyers and Conveyancers Act, which put a extra burden in terms of data sovereignty, and maybe what you see as any solutions coming that will give us a wee bit more confidence in the cloud or in a cloud-based environment.
Yeah, I think, I mean, firstly, I'm a little biased because Catalyst Cloud are purely New Zealand based and purely subject to New Zealand law. So technically you could use us and that wouldn't be a problem. But more broadly, I think that there is a big collision course that government is going on between do cloud at low cost and also somehow comply with all of those laws at the same time. And I think there's a reckoning coming about some of that critical infrastructure and what it will cost to actually make sure that it is properly controlled by us in a clear legal manner. But I also think that it's somewhat beholden on some parts of those industries to actually challenge government on, you keep pushing towards the cloud, but then we have these obligations. How is that going to be resolved? So yes, there are cloud providers of some services in New Zealand that can make a big difference. I'll be honest, the coverage is not as big as it should be. But that in part comes down to, so long as everyone's willing to not care about data sovereignty, they'll continue to plow billions of dollars offshore into multinationals. There's not going to be the investment in local providers necessary to actually meet any of those challenges. So we do have a little bit of a chicken and egg problem with the whole industry, I would say.
Thank you for that, Jared and David. I think while I'm waiting for other questions, so I have a question in terms of, like, given the data can flow between, like, across borders easily, and there's like a lot of complications with different things and providers, how can organizations strike a balance between data sovereignty and the benefits of global collaboration and innovation? Like, sometimes the features or, like, the things that the technology integrate with each other is so much advanced in a different way. So I want you to take a neutral approach into seeing how we can balance that in terms of the current things, because that's what most of the organizations in Canterbury Tech businesses are already signed up to. So what can we be aware of that?
Yeah, I think the first is to be aware of your supply chain. I think that's the most important part, is just be aware of what providers you're actually using as part of the service delivery. The second part, I think, is to look at compatibility for legislation and compatibility of thinking. For example, our Privacy Act is very heavily influenced by European Union approaches to privacy. We actually have adequacy status with the European Union, such that storing European citizen data in New Zealand is actually fairly easy and straightforward and well recognized. So there are jurisdictions outside New Zealand that are safer to store data in, but there's always going to be that tension between, I really want a service that just works, and where is it and who owns it and how is it actually run, that will lead to some difficult decisions about what technologies we can adopt, what risks we're prepared to accept, and being very, very aware of the actual data itself. In the end, data is taonga, and we need to, as custodians of data, be very respectful of that above all else. And that may mean that there are some services overseas that, as great as they are not necessarily going to respect that it is important and it is our data and not just free range to go through it. But there are circumstances where data can either be anonymized. EU GDPR talks a lot about pseudo-anonymization. There are things you can do to data that make it more tolerant to be stored in other locations. It's not the case that it's an all or nothing, but it does require a very careful understanding of your data, of your data architecture, of your security architecture that goes into where all of the pieces of the supply chain go into. And unfortunately, yes, that's a big overhead, but I think it's a necessary overhead to make sure that we respect, data as taonga.
That's fair. Thank you for that. I'm going to touch back again. Jared has asked a question about, can Catalyst host Microsoft products as you do on a Azure server?
Yes, you are permitted to host. I have to remember the licensing terms for this because it is complicated by the fact that Microsoft implemented some licensing terms that are quite complicated. License portability is permitted into Catalyst Cloud. We do actually have some software that is licensed from Microsoft that you can launch by default. And it is supported. And my understanding from Microsoft is that they do still support that. The license portability is treated as from on-premise rather than being able to absorb licenses from cloud. The challenges start to become that, some software vendors have decided that cloud, and more specifically their cloud, is the only way in which they want software to run. So there are certainly some issues about some services that are available from a software vendor are not impossible, but have complexities if you want to run them outside that cloud provider's ecosystem. Yes, you can theoretically run some of the stuff. It definitely has some challenges, but it is possible to do it.
Thank you for explaining that. I think Max Jones has a question in terms of Australia's TOLA Act, which has been used to access data held in other countries. So when it was introduced, there was a lot of noise about possible negative effects like this. Have they become a reality now?
It's hard to know how real the effects are because there are very few publicly visible examples of this taking place in cross-border ways. Part of the reason is that law enforcement doesn't really want to have to disclose cross-border data access. They consider that to be leaking their behavior that may let a suspect be alerted to what is actually going on. So there are very few really public examples of that legislation coming into effect. Similarly, there's no public examples I know of the Australian backdoor legislation actually being applied, in part because it's unlawful to tell anyone that you were asked to do that. So no, it's difficult to find really good public examples. The most well-known public example that led to the creation of the US Cloud Act was data stored in Ireland, and that there was resistance to it being handed over, and then the Cloud Act changed the law to say it had to be handed over, and that was the end of the discussion. So it is difficult to find really good public examples of this, particularly as law enforcement kind of don't want you to know you're doing this. So yeah.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair. I think Nick has mentioned about SPLA. If you can explain largely what that question is, I can help out. James, do you want to ask a question? You raised your hand.
Yes, thanks, Seku. Good day, David. Interesting talk. I was
Hi.
just wondering, I mean, you said at the start, we're basically all burying our heads in the sand about data sovereignty. And from what you've said, that sounds like a really valid option to me, in that this is a really hard problem. And as a sort of small to medium sized software provider, building line of business apps and that sort of thing for small to medium sized companies in New Zealand, and using multinational clouds to store their data and process the data and stuff like that. I mean, are we in any position to actually make a worthwhile or a good decision about this in any way? In that it seems like everything is contingent on so many other factors. And when you look at the people who should know the answers, they don't really have the answers anyway. So like the lead from the government basically sort of says what you're saying. It's difficult, think about it, take it seriously. But it doesn't really go beyond that. And how am I supposed to take that and then advise my clients on whether it's okay for them to store stuff in AWS or Azure or something like that,
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and I certainly feel the need sometimes to try and stick my head in the sand, but I think it's really important that we don't, because we do have that obligation under New Zealand law, and we are going to be subject to New Zealand law. And even if we feel that using a service is kind of the service that we're forced into, there's a really interesting section of NZISM that talks about how the usage of cloud services does not remove the obligation to protect data. In other words, you're still on the hook, even if the cloud provider has made particular promises or assertions about how they handle things. I think there's, at the moment, I do feel that the lack of any regulatory teeth will continue to mean that this isn't treated as much of a problem. I mean, with respect to our Privacy Act, it has very little teeth compared to EU GDPR. And so there is a certain amount of, we'll just accept this as the cost of doing business. But I think there are things that small organizations can very quickly do to manage their risks. The first is just simply to identify the data they have and where it is. And just by even beginning to document their risks, that will help when enforcement starts to potentially become more stringent about these things. So I would encourage small businesses to really begin their focus on identifying these risks and the risks they're exposed to, rather than necessarily trying to tackle them straight out. Because yeah, you're right, tackling them straight out requires much more fundamental long-term thinking about why is it we're here, and what the providers have in terms of risks. That identification of risk and what you could be exposed to, I think, is much more important, particularly as it's hard to explain to your boards and your shareholders why you may end up needing to spend money to resolve this as a problem. You've really got to come from risk as a starting point to help take those groups on the journey about how to resolve this.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
David.
for that answer. Thank you, James. Thank you, David. And thanks for keeping the questions in terms of more discussion oriented. And I think I am going to, looking at the time, I'm wanting to summarize and kind of wrap up. So please do, thank you for many of your questions, and for David to give a lot of context into understanding about data sovereignty, residency, and compliance, and getting to understand more detailed information about it. I think we can talk about it for ages. There's so many layers to unpack, but also about the Maori data framework and how we can work with. I really love the way that you placed data as a tuanga, as a thing, many of them are going as such. So it's kind of a really important topic in terms of the New Zealand context, and really appreciate all the work that goes into creating a greater kind of organization, but also a data sovereignty protected state that we are in as such. But yeah, thank you so much for everyone as well. Please reach out to David and go and chat with him if you have more questions, but also follow Catalyst Cloud and see what they're up to. And thank you for being here. And we're also going to talk about some concepts of data and AI ethics next time as well in the direct follow-up to this in our monthly meeting. So you can also check us out at that time. And I am going to seek Louisa and Jen. Do we have anything to wrap up?
I was just going to add that there's some really nice opportunities to continue talking about data as a taonga. We've got Dr. Karaitiana Tauru talking at the Canterbury Tech Summit on the 5th of September as well. So expanding on those concepts. So that'll be really interesting. Thank you so much, David. That was a really interesting discussion. Lots of thought-provoking stuff, and I can see you've got lots of people wanting to know about specific things. If you do want to get in touch with David, we've got a set of slides and an information sheet to hand out, so we'll send that out to all of the participants with the follow-up email, so that you can get in touch with David if you're interested to hear more. Thank you very much. And make sure you get your tickets to the Tech Summit.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Enjoy
you,
the rest of
everybody.
your
Thank you,
day.
David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.